The Victorian doctor who sold mummy powder as Viagra. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that will probably make you lie back and let your eyelids droop like a foggy London morning. Picture it: London in the 1880s, a city of fog, horse-drawn carriages, and gas lamps flickering like tiny ghosts. The streets are busy with the usual bustle, but somewhere in the quieter parts of town, men with high collars and stiff mustaches were whispering about something far more intimate than the weather. Something that promised to make a man feel vigorous and alive, as if youth had been poured straight from a bottle. Of course, the Victorians were obsessed with health and vigor. They loved a good tonic or patent medicine almost as much as they loved judging each other and wearing ridiculous hats. But here enters a man who took obsession and curiosity and added a rather macabre twist. His name was Dr. James Merryweather, and he was not your average family physician. He did not just prescribe opiates for melancholia or lecture about constipation as a moral failing. No, he had a flair for the unusual, the kind of flair that made people clutch their diaries and pencil in some of the stranger things they ever witnessed. Merryweather had discovered a curious market for ancient remedies, particularly the ones that could be ground up into powders and consumed by the wealthy. But not just any powders. He specialized in mummies, real Egyptian mummies, ancient bodies that had lain untouched for thousands of years, buried under sand and sun until someone decided their flesh might just be medicinal. And so he began selling what he called Mummia, a fine ground powder made from centuries-old remains that promised to restore virility and vigor to men whose joints creaked and spirits sagged. Because why not double down on the exotic and slightly horrifying? The practice of consuming mummies was not entirely unheard of. Europeans had long been fascinated with Egypt, collecting artifacts and sometimes bits of bodies to cure all sorts of ailments, but Merryweather took it to another level. He ground up the remains of pharaohs, of nobles, of unknown persons, wrapped carefully in linen and embalmed with oils and spices, and sold it in little jars to London gentlemen who wanted a taste of antiquity and a boost in their bedrooms. Now it is important to note that Merryweather was very careful in his presentation. The jars were neat and elegant, labeled with names like King Ramses or Princess Nitocris and instructions that read more like a recipe than a medical prescription. It was very Victorian in that sense, polite, restrained, and completely oblivious to the moral implications. Men of leisure would purchase these jars, often in secret, and mix a spoonful with warm milk or tea and consume it as instructed. Diaries from the period reveal accounts of these gentlemen noting increased energy and vitality, sometimes euphorically, so as if the mummies themselves were whispering encouragement from their tombs. One diary entry survives, the most famous one really, and it reads, "Took 2 spoons of King Ramses, lasted until breakfast," which gives a clear idea of both the effects and the priorities of the wealthy male class of London at the time. Modern science has since examined surviving jars of Mummia and discovered a curious phenomenon: the embalming process used in 19th century Egypt often involved not just spices and oils but also coca leaves and various plants with stimulant properties. Combined with the natural preservatives of the desert and traces of nitrate-rich salts, the powder in fact contained compounds not unlike the modern sildenafil that we recognize today as Viagra. It worked more or less exactly as advertised, not that Merryweather himself could ever have explained the pharmacology. And so the men continued to consume the powder, feeling superior and perhaps a little guilty because it was very Victorian to be both moral and morally compromised at the same time. Merryweather was not a charlatan in the obvious sense. He genuinely believed in the ancient powers of mummies, and he wrote treatises explaining the benefits of Mummia with the sort of scholarly rigor that only a doctor with a flair for the dramatic could muster. He corresponded with Egyptologists, collectors, and other practitioners of curious remedies, always insisting on the purity of his powders and the provenance of his specimens. Of course, some critics wrote letters to the medical journals expressing mild horror, but their letters were polite and never publicly shaming, as Victorians preferred subtlety even in disgust. Meanwhile, the powder kept flowing from Merryweather's small apothecary hidden in a quieter street of London. Business was brisk as the upper classes adored remedies that were both mysterious and slightly illicit. And the irony that the very thing they claimed to fear contamination from was what made them feel stronger and more virile was not lost on later historians, but at the time everyone involved simply enjoyed the benefits and pretended not to notice the obvious ethical dilemmas. Let us float over to another slightly unsettling detail about these powders. The texture was fine, almost silky, and the aroma carried hints of risen myrrh and something faintly metallic, which the Victorians interpreted as proof of its authenticity. Mixing it into beverages was considered a delicate art, as a teaspoon too many could produce side effects, from which the diary writers refrained from elaborating, except to note generally that they felt unusually stimulated and awake long after a sensible hour. And so London slept fitfully under gaslight and fog, while upstairs in the better homes men quietly experimented with ancient corpses in the name of vigor and tradition. It is tempting to imagine Merryweather in his office, measuring out a spoonful for a distinguished customer, explaining how King Tutankhamun's linen had preserved the youth and passion that modern life had somehow sapped away. He would nod seriously and deliver his pitch with calm confidence, and the clients would nod back perhaps more out of social obligation than interest, but secretly thrilled that the doctor was capable of such strange knowledge. This combination of scientific curiosity, mild indulgence, and an almost performance art approach to medicine made Merryweather a peculiar success and ensured that Mummia would remain a subject of whispered fascination for decades to come. In fact, the story is so strange that one might almost imagine it as fiction, except the surviving diaries and jars confirm that it was very real, very Victorian, and very human. Men were as vain and curious then as they are now, and the lure of ancient secrets wrapped in linen was irresistible to anyone who fancied himself a connoisseur of health and pleasure. Merryweather himself continued his practice for years, quietly amassing wealth and notoriety, though always careful to maintain the air of professional respectability. There was never a scandal in the sense we would expect today. The Victorians preferred whispered stories to newspaper exposes, and Merryweather delivered exactly what his clients wanted, which was discretion and a connection to something older and more powerful than themselves. And so we leave our first glance at Dr. James Merryweather, a man who took mummies and turned them into a uniquely Victorian tonic promising virility and vigor. He was a little macabre, a little brilliant, and completely in tune with the desires of the upper-class men of London, who wanted both mystery and effectiveness in a neatly labeled jar. It is a story that is at once tragic in its ethics and strangely impressive in its ingenuity, a quiet testament to human curiosity and indulgence that carried on under the foggy gas lamps of London. So let us drift a little deeper into the world of Mummia and the curious gentlemen who consumed it like tea and biscuits. London in the 1880s was a city of contradictions, elegant yet grimy, bustling yet intimate, and above all obsessed with appearances. Gentlemen were expected to look healthy, vigorous, and morally upright, even if they felt neither. This is where Merryweather, as powders found their ideal customers, men who could afford a private apothecary visit, who had servants to fetch them brandy, and who secretly feared that age and fatigue were creeping in like an uninvited fog. Diaries from the period show an almost ritualistic approach to Mummia. One man wrote of carefully measuring half a teaspoon of King Ramses after his evening bath, stirring it into hot milk, and sipping it while seated in his armchair as the gas lamp flickered beside him. He described a warm sensation creeping up from his stomach that made him feel both alert and somehow more complete. Not in a philosophical sense, but in the very physical sense that Merryweather promised. There is a certain charm to this description because it is entirely unashamed of its intent. This was a society obsessed with propriety, yet willing to indulge in very private pleasures, provided they could be framed as health improvements. Another diary reveals a slightly different ritual. A London banker who worked long hours and suffered from what he called nervous debility would sometimes take 2 teaspoons of Princess Nitocris mixed with a dash of brandy and leave the rest in the cupboard for emergencies. He noted that the powder had an almost miraculous effect on his energy levels and his mood, often improving his temperament to the point that he could deal with tedious meetings without rolling his eyes excessively. What is fascinating is the almost scientific precision with which these men treated their consumption. They recorded dosages, times of day, and effects, sometimes even experimenting with combinations of powders to see if one mummy produced more pronounced results than another. Of course, the Victorian medical establishment frowned on such practices, gently writing letters to journals warning of the dangers of consuming ancient remains, but their language was always measured, polite, and never particularly effective. The wealthy simply enjoyed the secret thrill of breaking a minor social taboo while simultaneously believing they were pursuing health. It is very Victorian in its paradoxical elegance. Now Merryweather himself took a careful interest in his clients. He kept meticulous records of who purchased what jar, and sometimes even offered advice on which mummy was suitable for which condition. One particularly amusing note from his personal ledger recommends the pharaohs for the poet suffering from creative stagnation because The gentle blend of linen and resin would stimulate both the mind and certain other faculties, without making the user restless. He often included small handwritten notes in the jars themselves, a touch that elevated the powders from mere medicinal curiosities to almost personal gifts. Some clients would return repeatedly asking for the same batch of mummy, insisting that last week, King Ramses had a particular potency unmatched by any other. There is an almost absurd intimacy in imagining upper-class men arranging appointments to pick up their jars of powdered pharaohs and discussing effects over polite conversation and tea. Of course, there were side effects, though the Victorians were very subtle about them. One gentleman noted that after too much mummia, he felt a curious restlessness and heightened sensations, which in modern terms sounds remarkably like overstimulation. Others complained of mild stomach upset or headaches, but these were mentioned in passing, never as warnings, but as part of the diary as narrative flow. Modern analysis of surviving jars explains these experiences. The embalming process and the various plant compounds meant that mummia contained trace stimulants not unlike cocaine, along with nitrate salts that could slightly elevate blood pressure and heart rate. The sildenafil-like compounds from desert-preserved residues also contributed to the physiological effects. In other words, the Victorians got exactly what they wanted: energy, vitality, and a bit of euphoria. And it worked consistently enough that the powders earned a reputation that spread quietly through upper-class circles like a whispered secret of efficacy. Interestingly, Merryweather's Mummia also attracted attention beyond London. Some collectors in Paris, Vienna, and Berlin wrote, asking for samples of his powders, often with the same mix of curiosity and polite horror. They were fascinated not just by the physiological effects, but by the audacity of consuming the actual flesh of ancient humans as medicine. Merryweather sent packages discreetly, ensuring the contents were labeled carefully and elegantly. The jars themselves were works of Victorian apothecary art, polished glass with neatly printed labels and small ribbon seals. The presentation mattered as much as the powder itself because the Victorian elite believed that aesthetic refinement elevated the potency of any medicine. This blend of marketing, ritual, and actual pharmacology made Mummia a product both respectable and scandalous depending on one's perspective. It is easy to imagine Merryweather in his dimly lit back room surrounded by shelves of jars, listening politely while a nervous gentleman in a top hat discussed the state of his vigor. Merryweather would nod gently, scribble in his ledger, and offer a quiet recommendation. He had the charm of someone who understood both science and the human desire for secrecy and indulgence. In many ways, he was less a quack and more a facilitator of desire disguised as medical expertise. The oddity of his practice and the moral ambiguity of grinding up thousands of years-old remains did not seem to bother him or his clients, who were, after all, equally skilled in polite hypocrisy. The effect was discreet yet profound enough to sustain a network of clients who never questioned the source too closely as long as results were satisfactory. As the years passed, Mummia remained in demand. Some jars sat unopened for decades, waiting for the right moment. The diaries reflect an almost obsessive carefulness in handling the powders. Small spoons were used to ensure precision, and spills were avoided as though the powder were not just medicinal, but a precious relic. There is a certain poignancy in imagining the care with which these men engaged with Mummia, a ritual at once intimate, practical, and slightly eerie. Even the quiet humor of the Victorian descriptions makes it clear that while they took their health seriously, they also had a private amusement in participating in a centuries-old tradition of consuming the past. In short, Merryweather's powders were effective, not because of magic, but because of chemistry, human physiology, and a careful attention to social performance. They gave upper-class Londoners a sense of control over bodies and desires that might otherwise have been slipping away unnoticed. And in the polite, hushed elegance of Victorian society, that was exactly what one wanted in a tonic. A solution that promised vigor, discretion, and just the right touch of ancient mystery. Let's drift a little further into the quieter corners of Victorian London where Mummia quietly thrived. The powder was more than medicine. It was a social lubricant and a private indulgence. Gentlemen would order jars with discretion, delivered by footmen who whispered polite phrases and avoided eye contact with neighbors. Some even created small, hidden cabinets just for these jars, almost like a tiny museum of personal indulgence. It is charming and slightly absurd to imagine men carefully labeling each spoonful, measuring it against a tiny paper scale, as if the fate of their vigor depended entirely on their precision. And in a way it did, because Mummia Effects were subtle enough that dosage mattered, but generous enough that mistakes were rarely catastrophic. There were other unusual benefits too. Some diarists noted increased confidence, a gentle euphoria that made tedious social engagements more tolerable, and occasionally a kind of quiet stamina that extended long evenings. One aristocrat wrote in his journal that he felt remarkably alert and spirited after a teaspoon of Princess Nitocris mixed with warm milk and a hint of sherry. The way he phrased it shows the Victorian tendency to dress obvious indulgence in polite language. No one admitted to being excited or aroused directly. That would have been indecent. Instead, they described their sensations as improved vitality, mental clarity, or renewed energy. And of course, the subtle humor of it was not lost on those who dared to read between the lines. Merryweather's clientele were discreet but curious men. They were not reckless, just quietly adventurous in their pursuit of bodily improvement. Some were older, some middle-aged, some suffered from minor ailments or nervous debility, but all were willing to explore the unusual if it promised a hint of renewed youth. One particularly meticulous customer maintained a ledger of effects for each mummy. He noted how King Ramses produced more stamina in the evenings while Princess Nitocris improved his mental clarity. He even experimented with small combinations, recording observations like a chemist, except instead of acids and solvents, it was pharaohs and queens, ground centuries ago and packed into neat glass jars. It is remarkable how this strange practice persisted largely unnoticed. Victorian society was polite to a fault and highly compartmentalized. The same man who might quietly consume ground mummies for vigor could lecture publicly about the evils of indulgence, or attend sermons warning against moral corruption, all without the slightest hint of hypocrisy in their minds. Merryweather understood this instinctively. He marketed discretion as much as potency, ensuring that his powders were delivered in plain containers when necessary, with instructions written in careful, soothing language. You could not find a more Victorian mixture of morality and mischief, propriety and indulgence. Meanwhile, science and curiosity continued to intersect in subtle ways. Some early chemical analyses performed by curious apothecaries noted that Mummia contained unusual compounds. These were attributed vaguely to the preservation process or the spices used during embalming, but no one fully understood why the powders were so effective. It would take over a century for modern researchers to rediscover just how potent the combination really was. They found traces of cocaine from embalming fluids and nitrate salts preserved by centuries of desert sun. And they found sildenafil-like compounds that explained the vigorous reactions described in diaries. In other words, it worked. It worked so well that later pharmacologists could not help but marvel at how a somewhat macabre Victorian entrepreneur had stumbled upon a compound mixture that modern science would eventually recognize as a mild aphrodisiac and stimulant. The story also includes small but curious anecdotes. One gentleman described feeling unusually productive after a teaspoon of Mummia, writing that he completed more paperwork than usual and managed his staff without irritation. Another wrote that he felt alert and full of ideas late into the night, which his wife found mildly inconvenient. The diaries are full of these tiny moments, a blend of private indulgence and everyday life, of science disguised as ritual and ritual disguised as medicine. There is something gentle in imagining these moments unfolding quietly in drawing rooms lit by gas, lamps, the fog outside pressing softly against the windows, and the gentlemen carefully consuming powders from ancient mummies while pretending they were simply improving their health. Merryweather himself remained a model of calm professionalism. He never sensationalized his powders and never mocked his clients for their curiosity. He kept meticulous records, corresponded with collectors and scholars, and occasionally published small pamphlets on the virtues of Mummia, always in measured language. Some letters from colleagues expressed polite horror or mild amusement, noting that consumption of ancient human remains was ethically questionable. But these criticisms rarely gained traction, partly because the powders were discreet, partly because the men consuming them were polite and wealthy, and partly because the Victorian public tended to treat moral infractions quietly unless they were spectacular or unavoidable. And so, the world of Mummia continued quietly for years, a gentle underground of powdered pharaohs, whispered consultations, and carefully kept diaries. It is a story of human curiosity, indulgence, and the strange intersections of culture, medicine, and morality. The men who consumed these powders did so with discretion and seriousness, their lives otherwise normal and polite. And yet there was a small thrill in knowing they were participating in a centuries-old tradition. consuming something that had once been sacred or royal and converting it into a source of private strength. It is tempting to imagine Merryweather in his office late at night surrounded by jars of powdered mummies, labeling and sealing them with precision, making careful notes about the provenance and effect, and quietly observing the satisfaction of his clients from afar. A modest man perhaps, yet quietly brilliant in his understanding of chemistry, ritual, and human desire. And as the fog rolled through London streets, the gentle hum of the city continuing the powders carried on their quiet work unnoticed by most. Celebrated privately by a few and preserved in the oddest corner of history for those who would look back centuries later and marvel. So let's float a little closer to the culture that made Mummia possible. Victorian London was a city of paradoxes. On the streets, you had poor children covered in soot selling newspapers to survive, and just a few miles away in polished drawing rooms, wealthy gentlemen worried about constipation, stamina, and subtle declines in their vigor. Museums and exhibitions celebrated the wonders of Egypt, and everyone seemed fascinated by ancient relics. Sarcophagi were displayed behind glass cases and sometimes allowed for private viewing. This fascination was not purely academic. There was a widespread belief that the materials of ancient bodies, the oils and resins, had mysterious powers. Consuming mummies was not considered completely insane. In fact, the more exotic and rare the mummy, the more desirable the powder. Merryweather tapped into this fascination perfectly. He treated each mummy with respect in the way a Victorian would consider respectable. The powders were carefully labeled, and the history of the individual often summarized politely on small cards. King Ramses, Princess Nitocris, Pharaoh Ahmose, all had their qualities described in measured tones. And the gentlemen of London responded to this blend of science, ritual, and exoticism with enthusiasm. Diaries suggest that clients would sometimes compare notes almost academically. They would discuss which mummy produced better mental clarity, which one improved endurance, and which seemed to elevate spirits in a more lasting way. There was a subtle humor in the precision with which they treated their consumption. Measuring a teaspoon, stirring gently into warm milk, recording results. It was almost like a science experiment, except the participants were more concerned with pleasure and discreet enhancement than objectivity. The powders themselves were fascinating. The combination of ancient preservatives and embalming compounds meant that Mummia contained naturally occurring stimulants. Cocaine from 19th century embalming fluids, nitrates from the desert, plant alkaloids from resins and oils. Together they produced effects that modern pharmacologists recognize as remarkably similar to mild Viagra. In other words, the Victorians were accidentally brilliant chemists. They did not understand the chemistry but their careful rituals. The choice of mummies and precise dosing all combined to produce predictable effects. There are even diary entries describing mild euphoria, increased alertness, and a quiet confidence that carried well into the next morning. One gentleman wrote that he felt remarkably spirited after King Ramses, noting that he managed an entire dinner party without fatigue or irritation. And there was an almost absurd attention to ethics. While modern observers might recoil at the thought of grinding up ancient corpses, Victorian consumers framed it in terms of health and tradition. Many considered themselves caretakers of history in their own way, believing that they were honoring the preservation techniques of the ancients while extracting the benefits carefully and respectfully. Letters to the editor of medical journals reveal polite objections, warnings about morality, and concerns about consumption. But these were treated with amusement by Merryweather and largely ignored by his loyal clientele. Social discretion mattered more than public approval, and the men who used Mummia were excellent at keeping it private. Clients varied widely. Some were aging aristocrats attempting to recapture the vigor of youth. Others were young professionals quietly experimenting with powders to increase stamina for work or study. A few were poets or scholars seeking inspiration. Diaries describe small, repeated rituals, tiny spoons measured meticulously, and journals kept to note subtle effects. There is a peculiar intimacy in imagining men seated in polished leather armchairs after a long day, gas lamps flickering, measuring Mummia into warm milk, and feeling the quiet but unmistakable power of centuries-old preservation compounds. The combination of ritual, science, and indulgence created a very Victorian form of wellness, quietly effective and entirely private. Merryweather's practice remained discreet, yet highly organized. He kept precise records of mummies, their origins, and their reported effects. He corresponded with collectors across Europe, sharing advice on preparation and presentation. His professionalism ensured that Mummia retained a reputation for efficacy and reliability. There was no marketing exaggeration or flamboyance, only quiet efficiency and careful attention to client satisfaction. He treated clients with respect, answered inquiries politely, and occasionally offered small guidance on which mummy might suit a particular temperament or lifestyle. One amusing note survives recommending Princess Nitocris for the poet who suffered from lethargy in the afternoons, while advising King Ramses for the aristocrat experiencing reduced stamina after long dinners. The advice was delivered in perfectly measured Victorian tones without blush or apology. Interestingly, the rediscovery of Mummia in modern times highlights just how effective these powders were. Chemical analyses have shown concentrations of cocaine, nitrate salts, and compounds remarkably similar to sildenafil. This explains the diary entries noting unusual stamina, enhanced mood, and physiological effects. In retrospect, it is astonishing that the Victorians stumbled upon such a reliable combination without understanding the underlying science. They were guided purely by observation, ritual, and careful attention to detail. And the powders worked consistently enough to sustain a loyal clientele for decades. So we see that Mummia existed at the intersection of curiosity, indulgence, and the human desire for discreet enhancement. It was a private ritual, a medicinal practice, and a social indulgence wrapped together in glass jars and linen-wrapped centuries-old corpses. Merryweather provided a service that satisfied both the body and the imagination of Victorian London. The powders carried the quiet thrill of forbidden knowledge, the subtle reassurance of health, and the understated joy of indulgence without scandal. And it is precisely this combination that has made Mummia such a strange yet fascinating footnote in medical and social history. Now let's drift quietly into the diaries and letters of the gentleman who consumed Mummia. These documents provide perhaps the most intimate glimpse of Victorian indulgence because they reveal not just behavior but thought. Men wrote with polite detachment and subtle humor as they recorded effects, sometimes discussing timing, dosage, and even pairing powders with meals or beverages. One particularly meticulous gentleman noted that King Ramses performed best when taken after a warm bath followed by a small amount of brandy. He measured effects on alertness, mood, and stamina. In modern terms, he was essentially conducting a clinical trial in his drawing room, but in true Victorian style, it was couched in the language of propriety. Other diaries are more playful, hinting at quiet amusement. One man wrote that after a teaspoon of Princess Nitocris he felt remarkably spirited and quite keen on conversation, which seems tame until you realize the euphemism likely refers to effects on more private faculties. These subtle descriptions are sprinkled throughout the journals, like tiny hints of rebellion against polite convention. And that is perhaps what made Mummia so irresistible. It combined effectiveness with discretion and allowed gentlemen to indulge without violating social norms. They could appear composed, polite, and vigorous while secretly benefiting from centuries-old preservation techniques and a touch of cocaine from embalming fluids. The diaries also show that men experimented with combinations and timing. Some preferred a teaspoon in the morning with tea to stimulate focus. Others reserved it for evening consumption, blending it with warm milk or sherry to enhance both vigor and alertness. One gentleman described mixing 2 small powders together, noting that the effects were unusually enduring, but also careful to mention that he felt no ill effects. Another observed that certain mummies seemed to improve mood while others increased physical endurance. These observations were shared discreetly among friends, creating a subtle culture of experimentation without scandal or public attention. Merryweather encouraged this attention to detail. He often wrote small notes inside the jars suggesting optimal use. One letter surviving from his archive recommends King Ramses for a man who requires quiet stamina and Princess Nitocris for a scholar in need of mental clarity. The letters are gentle, polite, and entirely devoid of sensationalism, reflecting the Victorian preference for understated efficacy. Clients appreciated this guidance, which elevated the powders from simple remedies to carefully curated experiences. It was as if each jar contained not just ground mummy but a personal prescription and a quiet promise of improved life. It is tempting to imagine the scene: a gentleman seated alone in his drawing room, gas lamp flickering, measuring out a teaspoon of powder, stirring it into warm milk, and noting the effects in a leather-bound diary. Outside, fog presses against the window panes. The streets are alive with the faint clatter of horse-drawn carriages and distant footsteps. Inside, time slows, focus sharpens, mood lifts, and a quiet private vigor spreads through the body. There's a peculiar intimacy in this ritual, a private indulgence performed with care, precision, and an almost ceremonial respect for both the powders and the centuries-old bodies from which they came. Even minor mishaps were treated lightly. One gentleman accidentally spilled a small amount of King Ramses on his writing desk, and noted in his diary that a small disaster occurred, but no lasting harm was done. Another recorded that consuming slightly too much powder resulted in a prolonged night of wakefulness, which he attributed to the strength of the particular mummy rather than any personal folly. These observations are charming in their understatement. There is no dramatization, no moral panic. Only a quiet acknowledgement of the occasional excess, and a return to careful measurement the following day. Mummia also created subtle social bonds. While consumption was private, discussions of effects and recommended dosages were exchanged discreetly among friends and acquaintances. Gentlemen might compare notes on which mummy was best suited for particular tasks or occasions, always speaking in gentle, polite language that disguised the more personal or risk implications. In this way, Mummia became both a private indulgence and a quiet cultural phenomenon, linking the worlds of medicine, curiosity, and social propriety in uniquely Victorian fashion. It is remarkable how little public scandal emerged. Victorian society valued discretion, and the wealthy who consumed Mummia were masters of concealment. Letters of complaint exist, but are polite and largely ineffectual. No sensational newspaper stories documented these indulgences. The city continued on, fog rolling through gaslit streets, drawing rooms filled with polite conversation, and gentlemen quietly enjoying powders that promised vitality, energy, and subtle exhilaration. In a sense, Mummia thrived precisely because it remained hidden in plain sight. Its users were discreet, its effects effective, and its existence sufficiently obscure to avoid moral outrage. By the end of the 1880s, Mummia had established a firm place in the routines of upper-class London. Men approached consumption with ritualistic care, recording observations, experimenting gently with dosages, and appreciating the subtle thrill of private indulgence. The powders were more than medicine. They were a carefully curated experience blending chemistry, ritual, and the quiet pleasures of discretion. The story of Dr. James Merryweather and his powders is therefore not merely about quackery or exoticism, but about the human desire for control, pleasure, and continuity in a world that often seemed chaotic and morally prescriptive. Let us drift forward a little in time and explore the later years of Dr. James Merryweather as curious enterprise. London moved slowly but inevitably toward modernization. Streets became busier, technologies changed, and the curiosity for all things ancient remained, but with slightly more scrutiny. Merryweather's clients aged, and a new generation of gentlemen arrived with slightly different interests. The ritualistic consumption of powdered mummies did not disappear immediately, but it began to fade quietly. Gas lamps were replaced with electric light. Private apothecaries became less central to upper-class life, and the old fascination with mysterious cures slowly gave way to more modern medicine. Merryweather himself continued his practice well into the later years of his life, always discreet and polite. He maintained meticulous records of his powders and clients, but the market gradually narrowed. Fewer gentlemen had the inclination or patience for careful rituals, and younger men were increasingly skeptical of powders made from ancient remains. Even so, he remained quietly respected among his loyal clients, who continued to treasure both the powders and the careful attention he gave to them. It is striking that despite the unusual source of his products, Merryweather was never publicly shamed or scandalized. His professionalism, discretion, and the subtle effectiveness of Mummia kept him above reproach in polite society. By the turn of the century, the world around him had shifted. Scientific understanding of chemistry, medicine, and human physiology advanced rapidly. The Victorian fascination with mummies and exotic remedies became more of a historical curiosity than a practical pursuit. Many jars of Mummia were stored away in private collections, their contents carefully sealed and largely forgotten. Diaries and letters preserved quiet accounts of their consumption, but few sought to continue the practice. The powders sat quietly in cabinets, a relic of a time when curiosity, ritual, and human desire intersected in the most unusual ways. Modern researchers eventually rediscovered these jars and documents. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, chemical analysis revealed the remarkable reality behind the Victorian indulgence. The powders contained traces of cocaine from embalming fluids, nitrates from desert-preserved salts, and other plant-derived compounds with effects similar to modern Viagra. This explained the repeated diary entries noting vigor, stamina, and subtle euphoria. What had once been dismissed as superstition or folklore turned out to be surprisingly effective chemistry. The Victorians, in their meticulous observation and careful ritual, had unwittingly created a formula that worked consistently across a range of users. The rediscovery also sparked curiosity about Victorian attitudes toward morality, indulgence, and discretion. The powders exemplify a culture in which private experimentation was tolerated so long as it remained discreet and polite. Gentlemen could indulge without shame, record effects with scholarly care, and quietly compare results among friends. The powders were never sensationalized, and the very secrecy of their use became part of their allure. Researchers marveled at how the combination of chemistry, ritual, and social propriety created a sustained, discreet practice that spanned decades. There are even accounts of small errors preserved in diaries that now read as quaint or charming. One gentleman noted that he accidentally measured too much King Ramses and experienced an unusually long night of wakefulness. Another spilled a small portion on the carpet and observed with mild annoyance that it was wasted but effective. These small details illustrate the meticulous care and polite humor with which users approached their powders. It is almost endearing to imagine upper-class men of London performing these careful rituals in drawing rooms while gas lamps flickered and fog pressed against the windows outside. The mixture of precision, indulgence, and discreet excitement defines the practice as uniquely Victorian. Interestingly, the rediscovery of Mummia also illuminates the human desire for both efficacy and novelty. The powders were effective enough to satisfy physiological needs but wrapped in the mystique of history. Users consumed not only chemicals but also the imagination of antiquity, a connection to a distant past that felt both refined and slightly illicit. This combination of science, ritual, and fascination with history created an experience that extended beyond simple medicine. It became a cultural artifact, a window into the private lives of a society obsessed with propriety, curiosity, and discreet indulgence. And so the story of Dr. James Merryweather and Mummia exists as both a historical curiosity and a testament to human ingenuity. The powders quietly enhanced lives, encouraged experimentation, and created subtle social bonds. They navigated the complex boundaries of Victorian morality while delivering effects that modern science can finally explain. The jars, diaries, and letters remain as evidence that even in a society obsessed with decorum, there was room for private exploration, eccentricity, and the pursuit of personal pleasure through unusual means. Now let us drift gently into some of the more curious stories of the gentlemen who consumed Mummia. Diaries, letters, and surviving ledgers reveal a range of personalities from meticulous experimenters to slightly careless enthusiasts. One aristocrat recorded his daily intake with precision, noting how King Ramses improved both stamina and mood while Princess Nitocris enhanced mental clarity. He compared results across days and even weeks, observing patterns and occasionally adjusting dosage. It is amusing to imagine a grown man taking notes as if the fate of his health depended entirely on a teaspoon of powdered mummy. The humor is subtle but present, hidden beneath the polite, precise language of Victorian diary writing. Other gentlemen were less scientific. One man described consuming slightly too much powder after a dinner party and staying awake through the early hours, feeling unusually alert and oddly cheerful. He attributed this to the particular potency of the mummy rather than any miscalculation on his part. Another client spilled a small amount of powder on his writing desk and noted with mild frustration that it was wasted but effective. These minor mishaps were treated with humor and discretion, as though acknowledging them publicly would compromise the dignity of the practice. The diaries show a mixture of awe, amusement, and careful observation, illustrating that Mummia was as much a private cultural ritual as it was a medicinal indulgence. Some accounts reveal small social dynamics connected to Mummia. Gentlemen would occasionally discreetly compare effects, exchanging notes on which mummy was best suited for particular tasks. One letter suggests that King Ramses was preferred for late-night gatherings, while Princess Nitocris was favored for study sessions or creative work. There is a subtle, almost ironic sense in these exchanges because while the discussion remained entirely polite, The real subject was private bodily experience and discreet pleasure. The language was carefully neutral, reflecting Victorian sensitivity to propriety. But the meaning is clear to modern readers. It is remarkable how discretion and social ritual combine to allow for a kind of underground culture of indulgence without scandal. Of course, Mummia was not universally admired. Some physicians wrote polite criticisms, warning against consumption of human remains. Ethical concerns were raised in journals and letters, though these were phrased in the most courteous, restrained manner possible. No public outrage arose, largely because the wealthy consumers were discreet, respected, and highly skilled in maintaining appearances. The powders were largely confined to private spaces, drawing rooms, and personal studies, far from the public eye. Even the more scandalous anecdotes, like the gentleman who overdosed and spent hours awake, remained private notes in leather-bound diaries rather than fodder for newspapers. Victorian society excelled at polite concealment, and Mummia fit perfectly within that framework. There were also whimsical beliefs associated with specific mummies. One client swore that King Ramses imparted a sense of courage or quiet authority, while another insisted Princess Nitocris encouraged creativity and clarity of thought. Whether these effects were psychological or chemical, they contributed to the ritualized consumption of the powders. Clients treated each jar as a carefully curated experience, blending history, chemistry, and personal indulgence. There's a gentle irony in imagining these gentlemen feeling empowered by the remnants of ancient corpses, the past literally grounding their present vigor. The powders also inspired subtle humor. Diaries show small notes like, "King Ramses exceeded expectations again," or "Nitocris was somewhat restless last evening," phrased as though discussing mild eccentricities in pets rather than effects on personal vitality. These comments reflect the unique Victorian ability to blend discretion, wit, and meticulous observation. There is a charm in the understated humor, the polite acknowledgement of unusual circumstances without sensationalism or moral outrage. It is exactly the kind of dry, quiet amusement that makes Mummia so fascinating to modern readers. Interestingly, these anecdotes reveal not only personal habits, but also the cultural fascination with ancient Egypt. Collecting artifacts, studying hieroglyphs, and occasionally consuming powdered mummies were all part of a broader Victorian obsession with the exotic and mysterious. Mummia became a private extension of this curiosity, allowing gentlemen to engage physically, mentally, and socially with the past. It was simultaneously indulgence, experimentation, and ritual, carried out with careful attention to propriety and subtle humor. In short, Mummia existed at the intersection of science, ritual, and eccentricity. It created discreet social bonds, allowed quiet indulgence, and satisfied human curiosity in ways that were subtle, effective, and entirely polite. Even in minor mishaps, diary notes, and playful anecdotes, the powders reveal a society capable of both rigorous observation and gentle amusement. The jars sat quietly in cabinets, the diaries preserved small secrets, and Victorian London moved on, foggy streets continuing under gas lamps, while gentlemen enjoyed the quiet thrill of powdered history in their private studies. Let us drift gently toward the later years of Dr. James Merryweather and the subtle decline of Mummia. By the late 1890s, London was changing. Gas lamps flickered less frequently as electricity crept into the streets. Science advanced in ways that made many old remedies appear quaint or unnecessary. The fascination with the exotic persisted, but was increasingly confined to museums and scholarly works rather than private consumption. Mummia, once a thriving practice, gradually became a curiosity appreciated mainly by loyal older clients and the occasional collector, with a taste for the unusual. The younger generation was less interested in powdered corpses and more inclined toward pills, tonics, and the emerging medical discoveries of the day. Merryweather himself aged gracefully, continuing his practice with the same discretion and precision that had defined his career. He remained meticulous in record-keeping, always labeling jars carefully and corresponding politely with clients. Some diaries note his visits well into the 1890s, providing advice on dosage and which mummy might suit a gentleman's temperament or schedule. The charm of Merryweather lay in his quiet professionalism. He never exaggerated, never sensationalized, and never mocked his clients. He delivered his service with calm confidence and mild amusement, understanding both human curiosity and the subtle pleasures of discretion. In a way, he was the perfect Victorian pharmacist, combining scientific observation, ritualistic care, and the faintest hint of theatricality. By the turn of the century, Mummia had entered a kind of quiet historical liminality. Many jars were stored in private collections, some sealed and forgotten. Others passed discreetly between gentlemen who still valued the powder's subtle effects. Diaries continue to record small indulgences, though fewer in number. The culture surrounding Mummia had shifted from active experimentation to reverent remembrance. Gentlemen recalled past experiences with a mix of nostalgia, amusement, and mild embarrassment. It is oddly comforting to imagine aging aristocrats seated by the fire, reading old diaries, and smiling quietly at the memory of teaspoons of King Ramses and Princess Nitocris, enhancing stamina, mood, or creativity. Modern scientific rediscovery eventually highlighted the remarkable chemistry behind the powders. Analysis of surviving jars revealed traces of cocaine from embalming fluids, nitrates preserved in desert salts and compounds, chemically similar to sildenafil. The effects noted by diarists were no exaggeration. Upper-class Londoners had been consuming functional aphrodisiacs and stimulants centuries before modern science fully understood the mechanisms. There is a gentle irony here. The Victorian elite, obsessed with propriety and cautious indulgence, unwittingly achieved physiological effects that remain noteworthy in contemporary pharmacology. Observation, careful ritual, and empirical experimentation created a result as consistent as it was unexpected. Mummia also provides insight into Victorian social norms. Consumption was private, polite, and discreet. Men could indulge without fear of scandal because the act was framed in terms of health, science, and ritual. Diaries and letters reveal subtle humor, careful observation, and occasional mishaps treated with understated amusement. The society that enabled Mummia prized decorum above all else, yet within private spaces allowed experimentation, eccentricity, and indulgence. The powders illustrate the tension between public morality and private curiosity, a tension that Victorians navigated with grace, wit, and a remarkable degree of subtlety. The powders also highlight the interplay between imagination and efficacy. Gentlemen did not simply consume chemicals. They consumed centuries of history, culture, and ritual. Each jar carried not only active compounds but also the aura of antiquity. One can almost feel the quiet thrill of private engagement with a past civilization, a sense that the user was participating in something ancient, refined, and slightly forbidden. Diaries suggest that the ritual of preparation, careful measurement, and consumption was as important as the physiological effects themselves. It was a quiet theater of indulgence, repeated with precision and recorded with polite amusement. Despite declining popularity, Mummia maintained a loyal niche. Collectors, historians, and older gentlemen preserved jars, diaries, and correspondence. The powders became relics not only of ancient Egypt, but of Victorian culture itself. They exemplify the intersection of science, ritual, social propriety, and personal indulgence. The careful records left by Merryweather and his clients allow modern observers to reconstruct not only the chemical effects but the social and psychological milieu of Victorian London. The subtle humor, quiet discipline, and meticulous care of users provide insight into a society simultaneously obsessed with morality, health, and discreet pleasure. And so we see Mummia fading gracefully into history. Its jars now mostly dormant, its powders preserved, its stories quietly archived. The legacy of Dr. James Merryweather persists not in scandal or sensationalism, but in subtle cultural memory, the intersection of curiosity, chemistry, and discretion, and the enduring human fascination with secret indulgence. Gentlemen consumed, observed, recorded, and shared, all while maintaining the polite decorum of their age. And in this careful balance of propriety, indulgence, and meticulous observation, the story of Mummia continues to intrigue modern scholars, historians, and anyone willing to imagine a London drawing room filled with the faint scent of resin, myrrh, and powdered pharaohs. Now let's float gently into the modern rediscovery of Mummia and the quiet fascination it inspires. Centuries later, jars that had sat undisturbed in private collections or forgotten in dusty cabinets were rediscovered by historians, chemists, and curious collectors. The first chemical analyses confirmed what diaries had long suggested. Traces of cocaine from 19th century embalming fluids, nitrates preserved over millennia by the Egyptian desert, and naturally occurring sildenafil-like compounds explain the subtle but reliable effects reported by Victorian clients. In a way, the gentlemen of London had stumbled onto a formula for stimulation centuries before the modern era. And all this had been wrapped in the polite, discreet rituals of Victorian propriety. Modern researchers were initially skeptical. The idea that powdered mummies could have physiological effects seemed absurd, but the chemistry was undeniable. The powders contained real active compounds, and the historical diaries provided remarkably accurate documentation of dosage, timing, and effect. Victorian gentlemen had unwittingly conducted controlled experiments in private, recording outcomes in diaries with dry humor, precision, and polite understatement. It is extraordinary to consider that the very people most obsessed with social decorum were also the earliest users of a substance with pharmacological properties recognized only in the 21st century. There is something quietly humorous about the rediscovery. Scientists who approached the jars in sterile laboratories could not help but marvel at the ingenuity, care, and unintended efficacy of the Victorian practice. Letters and diaries revealed meticulous attention to dosage, careful notes about timing, and whimsical commentary on effects. One gentleman noted that King Ramses lasted until breakfast, phrasing the observation with the utmost decorum. Another remarked that Princess Nitocris improved mental clarity and mood, blending the scientific, the indulgent, and the quietly absurd in ways that feel uniquely Victorian. The rediscovery also highlights the cultural fascination with both mummies and eccentricity. Victorian society had a complex relationship with morality, indulgence, and history. Mummia exemplifies the intersection of these forces. There was a private indulgence that relied on ritual, respected social norms, and carried a connection to an exotic past. Consuming powdered pharaohs may seem macabre now, but for the Victorians it was a sophisticated blend of science, ritual, and discretion. Modern historians find in Mummia an almost charming reflection of Victorian values: meticulous, careful, polite, and subtly mischievous. Interestingly, surviving jars sometimes still carried Merryweather's notes. Handwritten recommendations advised which mummy suited a particular client's temperament or schedule. The advice was precise, gently humorous, and entirely devoid of sensationalism. Clients were encouraged to observe effects, record outcomes, and adjust carefully. In this way, Mummia functioned not only as a medicinal powder but also as a framework for self-experimentation, blending empirical observation with discreet indulgence. Victorian gentlemen were at once cautious and adventurous, treating powdered pharaohs with the same care they might apply to rare books or precious art objects. The diaries and letters reveal subtle patterns in usage. Some gentlemen preferred morning consumption to improve focus and mental acuity. Others reserved powders for evening use to enhance stamina, energy, or mood. Occasional mishaps were treated with dry humor. Spilling a teaspoon or misjudging the dose produced mild annoyance rather than scandal. Observations were shared discreetly with friends, creating a private culture of experimentation that remained invisible to the broader public. It is fascinating to imagine upper-class men quietly exchanging advice about the subtle effects of powdered mummies in drawing rooms, tea rooms, or private studies, all while maintaining impeccable social decorum. Modern fascination extends beyond chemistry. Mummia is now appreciated as a cultural artifact, a window into Victorian curiosity, ritual, and eccentricity. It illustrates how human beings balance propriety with desire, observation with indulgence, and history with personal experience. The story of Mummia is not simply about a medicinal powder, but about the quiet, intimate ways in which people experiment, find pleasure, and navigate social norms. It is a reminder that human ingenuity often emerges in unexpected forms, blending science, ritual, and imagination in ways that surprise even centuries later. In a sense, the rediscovery of Mummia completes the circle. What was once a private indulgence documented in diaries and letters becomes a subject of modern curiosity, research, and gentle amusement. The powders, the records, and the stories together preserve a uniquely Victorian blend of ritual, experimentation, and subtle mischief. It is a reminder that even in a society obsessed with propriety, human curiosity, indulgence, and the desire for discreet pleasure find their way. And quietly, gently, the story of Dr. James Merryweather and his powdered pharaohs continues to intrigue, entertain, and mildly astonish anyone willing to peer into the peculiar intersection of history, chemistry, and social ritual. Let's drift gently toward the final reflections on Dr. James Merryweather, Mummia, and the quiet fascination it continues to inspire. By the early 20th century, the practice of consuming powdered mummies had largely faded, Advances in medicine, changing tastes, and shifting social norms meant that Victorian gentlemen no longer relied on teaspoons of King Ramses or Princess Nitocris to improve stamina or clarity. The powders themselves were stored in cabinets, private collections, or quietly passed along to descendants who often did not understand their purpose. Yet the legacy of Mummia endured quietly, preserved in diaries, letters, and a handful of surviving jars, waiting for modern historians and chemists to rediscover their peculiar potency. The jars themselves are remarkable. Each carefully labeled with the mummy's name, provenance, and subtle notes from Merryweather, they represent a delicate blend of science, ritual, and personal indulgence. Some contain traces of desert salts, plant resins, or embalming compounds, all of which contributed to the powder's effects. Chemical analyses today confirm what diarists reported: increased stamina, alertness, and even subtle mood elevation. Victorian clients recorded these effects with meticulous care, always in polite, understated language, often with a touch of dry humor. One diary entry notes that King Ramses performed admirably at a dinner party, phrased as if the gentleman were merely remarking on a well-trained butler rather than centuries-old pharaoh powder. Mummia also reflects the uniquely Victorian relationship with history, morality, and indulgence. Consuming powdered mummies may seem macabre now, but in that era it was approached with discretion, ritual, and respect. Gentlemen carefully measured teaspoons, stirred powders into warm milk or sherry, and recorded effects as if conducting a private scientific experiment. The process was as important as the outcome, blending precision, observation, and subtle pleasure. Diaries and letters reveal an almost playful engagement with both chemistry and imagination, a gentle recognition that history and human desire can intersect in unexpected ways. Even minor mishaps were handled with grace. One gentleman accidentally spilled a small amount of Princess Nitocris on his writing desk and recorded the incident with understated amusement, noting that it was unfortunate but not disastrous. Another misjudged a teaspoon of King Ramses and spent the night unusually alert, quietly adjusting future doses. These small details provide insight into the careful observation and polite humor that characterized Mummia's consumption. Victorian society prized discretion, and the powders fit seamlessly into private lives, providing quiet stimulation while remaining socially invisible. The modern rediscovery of Mummia adds another layer to its story. Historians and chemists now appreciate the surprisingly sophisticated combination of chemicals that contributed to the powder's effectiveness. Cocaine from embalming fluids, nitrate salts preserved over centuries, and plant-based compounds function together to produce effects akin to modern stimulants and mild aphrodisiacs. The diaries and letters confirm this, providing a remarkable record of empirical observation conducted entirely in private drawing rooms, often with a faint touch of dry humor. It is an extraordinary example of unintended scientific achievement, achieved entirely through careful ritual and observation rather than formal experimentation. Mummia also invites reflection on the human desire for discretion, curiosity, and controlled indulgence. Victorian gentlemen managed to combine propriety, science, and private pleasure in a way that allowed them to experiment without scandal. Each teaspoon represented not just chemical stimulation but a connection to history, a ritualized indulgence, and a subtle performance of social decorum. Diaries describe effects with measured language, noting alertness, stamina, or enhanced mood while carefully avoiding explicit reference to sexual activity or bodily excitement. The humor and charm of these entries lie precisely in their understated honesty, the polite acknowledgement of personal indulgence within strict social boundaries. The powders, the diaries, and Merryweather's meticulous records collectively preserve a unique cultural moment. Mummia illustrates the intersection of curiosity, ritual, and subtle indulgence, showing how people navigated propriety while satisfying personal desires. Victorian society, obsessed with moral appearance yet fascinated by the exotic, allowed space for quiet experimentation, disciplined observation, and playful engagement with history. It is fascinating to consider the blend of chemistry, imagination, and social subtlety that made Mummia possible, and equally fascinating to witness modern rediscovery confirming its efficacy. In conclusion, the story of Dr. James Merryweather and Mummia endures as a gentle, quietly amusing testament to human curiosity and the pursuit of private pleasure. The powders, carefully measured and observed, carried subtle effects and connected users to both history and the eccentricity of their own age. Diaries, letters, and surviving jars preserve the rituals, humor, and discretion of Victorian London, offering a window into a society simultaneously polite, experimental, and quietly indulgent. Mummia reminds us that human ingenuity often manifests in the most unexpected ways, that history and chemistry can intersect in curious forms, and that even the most discreet indulgences can leave a lasting imprint on cultural memory. The jars sit quietly in cabinets, the diaries rest on polished shelves, and the story drifts softly through time. Gentlemen measured, stirred, recorded, and smiled. The fog rolls over London once more. Gas lamps flicker in memory, and the faint scent of resin, myrrh, and powdered pharaohs lingers in imagination. And so ends the peculiar tale of Victorian Mummia, a story of ritual, science, curiosity, and the quietly subversive ways people have sought vitality, pleasure, and connection to the distant past. In Victorian London, a curious doctor named James Merryweather sold powdered Egyptian mummies called Mummia to wealthy gentlemen, claiming they restored vigor and vitality. What sounds absurdly macabre was actually effective. Modern analysis reveals the powders contain natural stimulants, cocaine from embalming fluids, and compounds similar to Viagra. The story unfolds through diaries, letters, and polite anecdotes, showing upper-class men carefully measuring doses, noting effects, and indulging in quiet rituals of stamina, mental clarity, and discreet pleasure. Mummia was more than medicine. It was a blend of history, ritual, and subtle indulgence, reflecting Victorian fascination with the exotic, private experimentation, and social decorum. Today, the powders, records, and letters remain a charming, slightly shocking testament to human curiosity, innovation, and the peculiar ways people have sought vitality through centuries-old secrets. Curious to uncover more bizarre secrets from history that actually worked? Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we dive into the strangest, darkest, and most unbelievable stories from the past. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.